For American television viewers in the 1960s, Astro Boy was just a fun little robot superhero with rocket-powered feet, huge eyes, and an exciting-sounding theme song who flew through the skies, battled villains, and saved innocent people. This was the perception most people had, and he was one of the first anime characters to gain mainstream attention among American audiences. But this is not how things began for this hero. He was never known as Astro Boy in Japan. His name there was Tetsuwan Atom, meaning mighty atom. This exciting sci-fi story was conceived in an era in Japan where the effects of World War II were still prevalent, and thus it carried much more depth and emotion. Nonetheless, when the series arrived on the other side of the Pacific Ocean in the early 60s, it underwent many changes beyond the name change. From character designs to episode numbering and even scenes and plot, everything was subject to cuts and reshaping. Yet not all of that managed to obscure the soul of the series. In America, viewers encountered a courageous robot boy with a human heart who stood up against injustice. But truly, even with the heart in the same place, the adaptation inevitably shifted the story's identity because the Astro Boy America met wasn't the Atom Japan knew. So what were they? Who were these characters? What changes were so massive that the differences immediately stood out? Let's dive on into this list of the 15 biggest differences between Astro Boy and Tetsuwan Atom and find out. Atom became Astro Boy. If we're talking about changes, let's start with the very first and most visible change of all, Atom to Astro. The name Atom had already been established in the original manga. For post-war Japan, the Atom stood not only for scientific progress, but also one of the greatest catastrophes in their history. Atom is a robot boy with all the pros and cons associated with that. He lives in an evil world full of intolerance, cruelty, and moral dilemmas, but everything changed when the series was brought to US markets in 1963. NBC Enterprises acquired the American rights, and in North America, Fred Ladd soon collaborated with NBC to translate the show into English, and it was eventually retitled Astro Boy. The series was eventually released to American audiences under that title. The difference is remarkable. The name Atom symbolizes progress and responsibility. Well, Astro Boy sounded like a cheerful Saturday morning superhero. Aside from the name change, there were other changes made to the series, such as changing the names of some characters and editing some episodes to meet the broadcasting standards of children's television programming in the US. This was the first time anime was aired in America. However, the biggest change was definitely the change of Atom into Astro Boy. The word atom had a very different connotation in Japan following the end of the Second World War, and the American localization gave the character a title that was more familiar to its intended audience. So they changed the name but kept the essence intact. The same big eyes, the same robot heart, but a slightly different name. Japan got 193 episodes, America got 104. One of the major differences between the two versions of Tetsuwan Atom was the amount of content available to television audiences. For instance, while the audience in Japan was treated to all 193 episodes produced between 1963 and 66, viewership in America was provided with only 104 episodes, which were dubbed into English.
I'll try, there's a big crack.
Good, try it, try anything.
However, the American version used only 104 of the 193 Japanese episodes, and thus, the American version was not even a full translation of the original, but a specially selected product. You might be wondering why this happened. Why cut all those episodes? Well, NBC, in collaboration with Fred Ladd, had to fit the series into American TV standards, syndication rules, and the conventions of children's shows. Some episodes were just omitted from the American version, although the specific reason for every omission isn't always clear. It's worth noting that the process involved more than simply translating the dialogue. The series also had to be adapted to appeal to young American audiences while satisfying NBC's standards and practices. As a result, some stories and moral conflicts were lost in translation, thus reducing the entire storyline conceived by Osamu Tezuka. Still, even after all the alterations made to the original series, its core stayed the same. Astro Boy was a benevolent robot boy who fought injustice, protected the weak and vulnerable, and sought to promote understanding between humans and robots. The US version never reached the Japanese finale. The single most striking difference between the Japanese Tetsuwan Atom and the American Astro Boy is their endings. Tetsuwan Atom ended on episode 193, titled The Greatest Adventure on Earth, but its American counterpart didn't see completion since the English version ended after only 104 episodes. As a result, American audiences received only part of the Japanese series. It wasn't the result of any intentional effort to creatively alter the ending. The English version was developed while the original Japanese show was still airing and used some of its episodes for English-speaking audiences. The Japanese series ultimately continued for another 69 episodes beyond the first 124, while the American version had already finished airing. The difference between the two endings had a significant effect on how the story ultimately unfolded. In episode 193, abnormal sunspot activity causes the Earth's temperature to rise to disastrous levels, forcing humanity to move into space and leaving robots behind to care for the planet. With the absence of this climax, American audiences inevitably developed a different perception of the series. The impression was that Astro Boy was an open-ended series following the adventures of a robot boy hero. However, for Japanese audiences, the story evolved into something much grander, exploring topics concerning the future of humanity and our planet. But perhaps this wasn't such a bad change. I mean, the 1963 series had a far more apocalyptic and philosophical conclusion, which might have been a little too heavy for a show marketed towards younger audiences. Tobio's death was rewritten to make him more innocent. The death of Atom's human counterpart is one of the key scenes in both adaptations of the manga. In the Japanese version, the creation of Atom by Dr. Tenma takes place after the death of his son Tobio in a car accident. In the English language adaptation, the scene has been preserved, but some elements of the story were altered. For example, the name of the son changed. He was now called Astro Boynton.
Listen, Astro Boy.
What makes the localization of this scene so interesting is the way the scene of the accident itself has been localized. The show's producer, Fred Ladd, was concerned the accident shown might create the impression that Tobio drove the car irresponsibly. In the American adaptation, additional narration was added to explain that at the time of the accident, the vehicle was operating under an automated highway system. The sadness of a father who lost his son was left intact, and thus, Dr. Boynton still had the same reason to create Astro Boy as a substitute. The rest of the plot remained unchanged. Astro Boy is still created through loss, he's still struggling to be able to fulfill an unattainable ideal, and he still ends up being abandoned since he can never actually take the place of the dead son. What did change was the emotional context of the tragedy. In the Japanese version, the tragic incident can be seen as the result of a simple human mistake. However, in the English version, it's an unexpected accident that happens to Astor without any fault of his own. Dr. Tenma becomes Dr. Boynton. Among the most obvious alterations made in the American version of Tetsuwan Atom was a renaming of some of the characters. Dr. Umataro Tenma was renamed Dr. Boynton, Tobio was renamed to Astor Boynton, Professor Ochanomizu was called Dr. Elephant, and Uran was called Astro Girl. Names of other minor characters were also changed, which made them sound better for children who watched TV in the USA. This was a step in the localization process and not an attempt to hide the origin of the cartoon. In the early 1960s, Japanese cartoons were virtually unknown in America. Producers Fred Ladd and NBC wanted the show to sound more accessible to American children who had trouble pronouncing Japanese names. Thus, many of the main characters in Tetsuwan Atom were given American-style names without affecting their roles in the cartoon's storyline. According to Frederick L. Schott, who later translated the manga, these were clever changes of the names, but it is worth noting that renaming the characters also influenced the overall feel of the series. Dr. Boynton and Dr. Elephant helped make the setting feel more universal and futuristic rather than strongly rooted in Japanese culture. Instead of placing viewers in post-war Japan, the English version allowed them to enjoy a sci-fi world that could exist anywhere. This made it easier for American audiences, especially children, to relate to the plot immediately, as they didn't have to become familiar with anything culturally unfamiliar. On the other hand, the original names carried cultural connotations that could help viewers understand the influence of Osamu Tezuka on the work. Today, translators are making efforts to restore names such as Tenma, Ochanomizu, and Uran. Robot discrimination became more superhero-friendly. Osamu's Tezuka premise regarding robots in Tetsuwan Atom was that robots could represent marginalized groups. In his manga, Atom encounters robots used for labor, discriminated against due to inequality, treated as replaceable goods, and even simply feared because of their differences. Such stories raise some very controversial issues. Is an artificial creature capable of having feelings? Should robots be given civil rights? What distinguishes a person from an object? Tetsuwan Atom was a tale of discrimination and misunderstanding, which is how he approached the issue of human prejudice using robots as the lens. The anti-war, ecological, and ethical themes related to the progress of science are incorporated into the manga as well. When it was adapted into Astro Boy, such themes remained, but they were depicted differently. In order to adhere to American television standards and please the youth, Fred Ladd toned down some of the dark and philosophical ideas. Action episodes featuring clear-cut good guys and bad guys, along with the bravery of Astro, suited the atmosphere of American TV in the early 60s. This is why Astro was more often shown as a brave robot boy who struggled against evil and defended innocent people instead of a symbol of social discrimination existing in the world, which raised questions regarding its social status. In other words, the first impression the show made on the viewers changed. Japanese viewers were presented with stories that could raise questions about discrimination and coexistence, while the American adaptation placed a greater emphasis on Astro as a heroic sci-fi figure. However, Tezuka's message was preserved nonetheless. Violence was cut or reduced. One of the more impactful changes made when Tetsuwan Atom was adapted for American audiences involved the show's violence. Producer Fred Ladd had to make several changes to meet the requirements of NBC's standards and practices, which imposed much stricter guidelines on what children could watch. This is why scenes involving violence, nudity, and certain religious references were cut, shortened, or even outright eliminated. Ladd said that many things could happen in Japan that would never pass American broadcast censors. Furthermore, Tezuka's official website states that the English version was carefully adapted for foreign audiences rather than simply translated. Importantly, many of these changes didn't affect the main storyline. Astro still fought evil robots, he still helped innocent people, and he defended those who were being oppressed. However, many stories lost their emotional strength. In the original Japanese version, violence wasn't shown for fun. Characters could be wounded or killed, and instances of cruelty underlined Tezuka's warning about man's abuse of power. In toning down such elements, the American adaptation tended to strip the episodes of some of their tragic aspects. This alteration also played an important role in shaping Astro Boy's character. Whereas the Japanese version presented Astro's compassion against a world that could be brutal, the English version placed greater emphasis on his heroism and adventures. In Japan, the main character's decision not to respond to hate with more hate made him a moral person. In the US, the adaptation placed greater emphasis on his role as an action hero. However, despite this difference, the essence of the series remained the same. The adaptation did not completely abandon Tezuka's philosophy, but it presented many of the same ideas through the expectations of American children's television at the time. Nudity and sexual material were removed. However, one of the least known and most essential modifications to Tetsuwan Atom included removing all the nudity as well as other content that wasn't deemed suitable for viewing by children. These edits weren't done due to any provocative elements present in the initial version of the show. It's actually because of the vast gap between broadcast regulations and cultural norms in both Japan and America in the early 1960s. The producer who was responsible for adapting the series into English said that he had to make it appropriate for broadcast according to NBC's standards and practices. According to information from Cartoon Research, Ladd removed all nudity scenes as well as violent scenes and religious elements since he believed that none of these elements would be allowed to be shown in America. The nudity removed from the Japanese version was generally non-sexual in nature. It would include scenes of children bathing, nude people in the background, as well as some other scenes that weren't considered offensive to Japanese audiences. Thus, such instances were excised, edited, or omitted from the English version. This shows that localization was more than just translation. Ladd and his team had to modify certain visual aspects of the show to make it acceptable for American television networks and reassure parents that it met their expectations for children's programming. These alterations didn't significantly affect the storyline, but they did remove some subtle elements of Japanese culture and social behavior. Ultimately, the American version of Astro Boy differed not only in language, but in the perception of what children are supposed to watch on TV. Religious references were treated carefully. Yet another significant alteration to the American version of Tetsuwan Atom related to religious motifs and references. As noted by the producer, Fred Ladd, the offensive religious references were removed since they wouldn't pass the standards and practices of NBC intended for American children's television programming. Similar to the violent or nude scenes, religious elements were considered too controversial for American television programs in the early 1960s. Religious aspects played a completely different role in the original Japanese television series. Instead of promoting any concrete religion, Osamu Tezuka incorporated religions, gods, cults, sacred items, and myths into his science fiction world. Episodes entitled The Religion of Pui Pui and The 13 Mysterious Statues of God indicate that spirituality and religious elements could be combined in the original series with fantasy, mysterious atmosphere, and future visions. Shrines, crosses, mysterious statues, religious organizations, and mythical characters could easily fit into the world of adventures in the TV series. Yet, when it came to American television, this content was viewed as being somewhat delicate. Ladd felt that the references to religion may confound people or even raise issues with the parents or television censors, so the scenes including the religious elements had to be toned down or cut out as needed. This wasn't done with the intention of destroying the episodes, but rather adapting the stories to suit the needs of American children's television standards at the time, which treated some religious references as sensitive, especially if they were references to non-Christian religions. This resulted in several subtle alterations to Astro Boy. The Japanese version was willing to embrace the strange and pulpy mix of sci-fi, folklore, mythology, and philosophy, and thus, their futuristic world was full of surprises and had a distinctly unique cultural flair to it. In turn, the American version retained the same robot adventures while removing or altering some religious and mythological elements. The soundtrack was sweetened for American TV. When Tetsuwan Atom became Astro Boy in America, Fred Ladd did more than just edit some scenes and change some voiceover. Considering that limited animation appeared somewhat static to American audiences, sound was considered a useful tool to make the series more dynamic and lively. The soundtrack was supplemented with additional sound effects and other audio changes. Fred Ladd had experience working on radio shows where sound effects were often used to make a listener believe that the world around them was more complex. He said that the soundtrack can be sweetened so that the audience thinks that things are moving faster than what's really happening on screen. Each and every day, sounds were added to scenes that initially seemed quiet. Sounds of passing cars and traffic noises were added to city scenes, while nighttime scenes received the sounds of barking dogs and distant trains. The US version also featured additional grunts, footsteps, background conversations, and Foley sound effects to make actions more concrete and tactile. This helped the show to overcome budget limitations by making still images more dynamic through the use of audio elements. The music was modified as well. Ladd proposed adding English lyrics to Tatsuo Takai's recognizable theme song, and those lyrics were written by Don Rockwell, making it a catchy tune for American viewers. Ladd later recalled that Tezuka was impressed by the English version and subsequently introduced Japanese lyrics to the theme. This was important due to the fact that Astro Boy was very dependent on a limited animation style, with fewer drawings and less movement compared to the majority of American cartoons. Through the addition of new elements to the soundtrack, the US version managed to create an illusion of dynamism. The American theme created a new pop identity. One of the biggest changes Fred Ladd made while adapting Astro Boy wasn't really a change at all, but rather an addition: the theme song. Ladd felt that a vocal theme would suit American children's television, so he recommended keeping the original melody while adding English lyrics to create an engaging theme song. The song became There You Go Astro Boy, which instantly introduced viewers to their superhero flying into action. What may have seemed like a small adjustment had a big effect on the show. The Japanese broadcast initially used an orchestral version of the theme, but a vocal version was introduced during the series' run. Ladd would later claim that Tezuka was impressed by the American opening and subsequently had Japanese lyrics added to the theme. In a rare reversal of the standard localization process, the American localization influenced the presentation of the original Japanese series. It also helped create greater brand uniformity for the show. Although the Japanese series used different versions of its theme music over time, the American localization retained the same theme music throughout its syndication. This approach helped build recognition as viewers began to associate the song with Astro Boy, much like the theme songs of other superheroes from that era. The change therefore went beyond a simple choice of music. It helped turn Astro Boy into a recognizable brand with its own pop culture image, showing that localized versions could sometimes influence the original series in return. Some dark Japanese episodes were simply not part of the US package. The localization didn't entail changing some dialogue or cutting out problematic scenes. In most instances, full episodes from the original Japanese run of Astro Boy weren't present in the American version. While the Japanese version ultimately produced 193 episodes for the 1963 show, only 104 of those were released in America, meaning American TV viewers missed dozens of stories entirely. One clear example is episode 32, Hot Dog Corps. According to the Tezuka episode guide, the episode details how mad scientist Dr. Ponkotsu implanted dogs with robot brains and how they formed the Hot Dog Army to rebel against humanity. It was a story involving animal experimentation, artificial intelligence, and conflict between robots and humans. This was in sharp contrast to most of the other episodes, and as a result, Hot Dog Corps never reached American audiences in any form. This exclusion highlights another important aspect of cartoon localization. It wasn't simply a matter of removing certain scenes from individual episodes. The episodes included in the American version were also chosen with great care. However, it would be wrong to overgeneralize the reason for this exclusion. First of all, there's no proof that Hot Dog Corps was excluded from the series due to its controversial nature. What is clear is the fact that this episode was part of the original Japanese version of the cartoon and had an unusually scary plot about robots made out of dogs. We were never given a clear reason why this episode wasn't included in the American version, but we can certainly draw our own conclusions. The Japanese episode plots were often much darker than the US brand suggested. Tetsuwan Atom was frequently much darker than the rosy picture that was painted by Astro Boy's advertising in America. Though viewers in the US were told of the good-natured robot superhero that fought on behalf of humanity, many of the Japanese episodes featured wars, killings, exploitation, dictatorships, and corrupt morals. These topics were chosen because Osamu Tezuka was not afraid to address some of society's pressing concerns through the medium of children's entertainment and was willing to do so without resorting to adventures. The official Tezuka Productions episode guide confirms just how adult-oriented many stories were. For example, in Robotland, the innocent-looking park hides a factory in which slave robots are made to produce weapons. This is quite different from the idea of robots being happy machines. In Führer ZZZ, the main character is a criminal leader who wants world domination and kills his twin brother in order to achieve that goal. The Human Farm is a story in which humans have been kidnapped and raised as livestock on another planet. The Yellow Horse, on the other hand, depicts Astro's discovery of an illegal operation of weapons production for the purpose of waging war, which is disguised by the practice of selling drugs, thus creating a direct connection between organized crime and the international war conflict. When Astro Boy was adapted for American TV, the dark side of the story was largely hidden away from the audience. Even though many episodes dealt with serious issues, the show as a whole made it clear that Astro was a daring and optimistic robot whose adventures were suitable for children. This, combined with censorship and other alterations of the content, led to the perception of a rather funny superhero show instead of one that consistently depicted slavery, war, dictatorship, the cruelty of humans, and moral dilemmas. Thus, American viewers didn't encounter the full range of themes present across the Japanese series. Midoro Marsh became a strange preservation story. Most of the distinctions between the two adaptations consisted of localization, such as editing, changing the soundtrack, or eliminating content due to American television censorship laws. Episode 34, Midoro Marsh, is one of the most unusual preservation stories connected to the 1963 series. The episode was poorly received by Tezuka, but an American export copy survived. First airing on Japanese TV on August 20th, 1963, the episode shows Astro Boy investigating claims of prehistoric monsters living in the legendary Midoro Marsh. Tezuka, who wanted to give the usual staff at Mushi Production a break, decided to outsource the production of this episode to Studio Zero, an animation studio founded by some of his former protégés. Most of them, in fact, would later become famous mangakas. However, lacking experience in actual animation, the result didn't match the overall level of the series at all. Characters were badly off-model, the animation was inconsistent, and the production was simply below the standards set by Tezuka. According to specialist accounts, Tezuka was so dissatisfied with the episode that he wanted the film destroyed after its first airing. However, at this point, one significant thing had already happened. Along with many other episodes picked for export to foreign territories, a copy had been sent to America, where it was dubbed by producer Fred Ladd and given the title The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. Since the export print survived, but the original Japanese material was lost, the American print turned out to be the only existing print of this episode for years, but that's not all. Much later, the original Japanese soundtrack was rediscovered and synchronized with the existing American print of the episode, and viewers could finally enjoy something close to the original broadcast. Without the American export, this famous episode of the 1963 series might never have been found at all. Thus, Midoro Marsh is the only case where the American adaptation of the series turned out to be an accidental archive. The US version became an anime gateway, while Japan's Atom was a domestic revolution. While Tetsuwan Atom and Astro Boy essentially followed the same storyline, each version revolutionized the television industry in its respective country in a unique way. In Japan, Tetsuwan Atom was much more than just a popular children's show. As stated by Tezuka Productions, Tetsuwan Atom became the first 30-minute animated TV series in Japan and laid down the basis for modern Japanese anime television production. Popularity of the series, which resulted in viewer ratings higher than 40%, proved that weekly animated television shows were viable as entertainment products, unlike short animated theatrical releases. The production technique used by Tezuka and Mushi Production would serve as an inspiration to many future anime producers in Japan. However, the significance of the anime series for the United States was quite different. After being renamed Astro Boy, the show became one of the first Japanese animated series to receive national broadcast on American television. Through editing, dubbing, dialogue rewriting, and other changes required for American broadcast, the series took on the feel of an entertaining sci-fi story. The basic storyline, characters, and themes remained the same, but there was something uniquely American about the way it was done. Most people were unaware that this was a Japanese product, and it would be years before the term anime would become part of the lexicon for Japanese cartoons. This dichotomy allowed the franchise to exist simultaneously in two completely different cultures. In Japan, Tetsuwan Atom was a radical departure from previous animation, giving birth to what would become television anime. In America, Astro Boy served as a portal to the rest of the world, demonstrating that Japanese animated stories could bridge cultures through localization. The package may have been adapted for two very different TV industries, but the story behind the name change was always the adventures of one robot boy. Be it Astro Boy or Tetsuwan Atom, the optimism and humanistic core was an enduring theme. Though American audiences received a shorter and much more heavily curated version, they still found Tezuka's creation as enduring as ever. These 15 differences, from stories being heavily edited to characters being outright renamed, are kinda just indicative of how media worked back then. If you compare any of the later anime that traveled overseas to America, you'd notice less culling, and you wouldn't think that the American version was an attempt to censor reality. The context of different times and cultural biases plays a big role, no? What are your thoughts on these changes? Are they justified? Let us know in the comments section down below, and while you're down there, don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, because that's the best way to see more stuff like it. Otherwise, thanks for watching, stay safe out there, and we'll see you next time.